Hi, it's Alan from Sherpa People Systems, and I wanted to share a sketch, a diagram that I put together to explain why all of our roles as leaders are transforming so profoundly at the minute. And a lot of it's to do with the context, the changes happening around us. And the best way to sort of describe that is that for a lot of us, we're kind of, our houses keep flooding, so we keep adding sandbags to the front door, hoping that's going to change things. When the reality is that further upstream, there is a dam and there's a crack in the dam. And because we can't see the crack in the dam, we keep addressing the issue at the home level rather than looking at the bigger picture. So that's the purpose of this quick video. So let's have a quick look at this sketch. Now, this sketch was inspired by the leadership circle, but I've added a whole other layer of information because at Sherpa, we don't really just take our material from one source. When we do leadership training, we use a number of sources rather than stick to one particular philosophy or framework. So the leadership circle described how we're in a world where organizations are moving from survival to a kind of sense of purpose. Actually, there's a much deeper and bigger change that's going on. It's what Peter Senge describes as a sort of fundamental shift in society, and I've heard that mentioned a couple of times. Frederick Laloux as well has also mentioned the same thing. And what really is happening is we're moving from an understanding that organizations are not simply mechanistic. That's very much the sort of Tayloresque view of the world, the Darwin view of the world, survival of the fittest. And we're actually moving to this understanding that organizations are organic. This is very much driven by the likes of Peter Senge, systems theorist, and also just practical common sense. Peter calls it human enacted interdependence, but basically organizations are groups of people who decide to work and behave in certain ways. That's an organic process. Elizabeth Sartouris, which is the name that you see here, is an evolutionary biologist who says that Darwin wasn't quite right. It's not survival of the fittest. In most cases, it's survival of the most cooperative. So these are fundamental underpinnings that are changing how organizations operate. And Good to Great, the book by Jim Collins, was one of the first books that started to articulate that companies with a clear sense of purpose outperformed companies who, acted in this survival mode. So what do mechanistic companies look like? A lot of this you will recognize in your own organization. They're focused on not losing, and they tend to hold on to the past. So if we look at the financial crisis, a lot of the banks haven't really changed a whole heck of a lot since the financial crisis. They're holding on to similar systems and processes, similar frameworks in terms of organizational frameworks, and very similar ways of remunerating people. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying this is what established organizations try to do in this kind of mechanistic perspective. Purpose-driven organizations have a focus on a higher vision, and rather than holding on to the past, they tend to lean into the unknown. And whereas a mechanistic organization has a reactive structure, a more purpose-driven organization has a creative structure, and more organizations are trying to move from left to right. And once again, you'll see a 20%, 80% figure here. It's not to say that this is all bad. There are really important aspects of this organizational system that are important. We still need processes and strong systems. But what we're saying is that the mix of purpose-driven compared to survival-driven is changing, and that change brings about stress in the system. Reactive structure organizations are focused on problems or threats. So we're constantly focused on our competitors, and we're looking at the competitive threat. It's a fear-based kind of culture, and that fear creates reactions that drive more of the sort of problem threat thinking. So this is the sort of fear-based culture that many of us have experienced in our careers. And the leadership style here is obviously command and control. In a purpose-based culture, we're driven by a sense of passion. We're trying to achieve something greater than ourselves, and that produces what I would call positive actions. So rather than a reactive state, we're in a positive, proactive state, and that again feeds into the purpose and vision, which again powers this passion. And this is an upward spiral that is termed by Barbara Fredrickson, who is a leading scientist in positive psychology, and this is typically a kind of a negative spiral. So we're constantly worried, we're constantly on edge. Now, what I've added to this diagram is a competing values framework, because that actually fits quite beautifully. I've put it on its side, but hierarchy and control, market and compete, these are very much the worlds of the survival mode, whereas clan and collaborate, adhocracy, and the sort of creative style of working, which you see in Patagonia, this is more to do with agile and lean, are very much part of the creative structure. Laloux's framework, for anyone who knows Frederic Laloux's work, he says that organizations change as our collective consciousness improves and grows and matures. So we've gone from red, yellow, orange being command and control, and now we're moving to green and teal, and green is where agile and lean fit, and teal is where you have adhocracy and you know, more advanced organizational theories. So just moving further down to bring this to the personal level for you as a leader, this you will recognize very much that on the left-hand side, the reactive structure values profit maximization. A lot of organizations say, you know, our people are our greatest asset, but the truth of the matter is that because of our financial system, profit maximization is the number one goal. On the right-hand side, organizations tend to have values that are more based around, say, the triple bottom line. So profitability is still important, but also is some kind of greater social mission and some kind of environmental objectives. And for many of us, we've seen our organizations move from this to trying to move to something like this. And the challenge is that when we move from this more traditional mechanistic view of organizations to the organic view of organizations for leaders, that is quite challenging. Doubts come in, fear comes in, because we're moving into a wholly different way of working. But it is inevitable that all of us are going to move towards the right-hand side. As leaders, this is probably the greatest change that's going on right now in terms of context. This is really the dam with the crack in it, and this is what we need to sort of look at and address. That what's happening in our organizations is we as leaders are trying to create more purpose-driven, passion-filled organizations, and yet we are dealing with constantly a sort of reactive, fear-based, mechanistic command and control kind of environment. So on the left-hand side, we're focused on well-being of the self. On the right-hand side, well-being of the whole. Now, this is a lot that I've added to the Leadership Circle's work, and this is profoundly important. This is some of the science that we teach in any of our leadership training. But what most people don't understand is that 70% of the human brain is survival oriented. So it's hardly surprising that this model of organization has been the predominant model for so many years, at least since the Industrial Revolution. And only about 30% of our brain is geared towards reward orientation. So survival orientation tends to have the sort of fear-based negative emotion, and fear drives the behavior. And you'll see the symptoms of this kind of cortisol environment, this command and control environment. So you'll get silo mentalities, people competing for resources, displays of anger, bullying, lack of innovation, fear of failure, people not working well together. And this is an environment that's managed by rules because fundamentally we don't trust our people. It's also underpinned by what Carol Dweck would call a fixed mindset, that we believe people have only certain capacities, that's the only capacity that they have, and that's the way it will always be. So we put our factory workers into little boxes and leave them there and hope that they'll just do the work for the next 20 years of their career or 5 years and everything will be fine. On the right-hand side, though, when you are in a purpose-oriented organization, we are really focused on the reward orientation of the brain, which drives positive emotion. Barbara Fredrickson's work around positive emotion is very powerful, because what she has started to prove is that positive emotion was critical to us going from individual bands of hunter-gatherers to forming small villages and towns to cities. Cooperation is key. And positive emotion are drivers of cooperation and compassion and so on and so forth. It's her broaden and build theory. So we collaborate more, we're more innovative, we're more creative, there's less stress and dysfunction, we embrace failure, we create an upward spiral. Oxytocin, the neurochemical, is a predominant driver in this environment because there's a lot more psychological safety. In this environment, and command and control on the left, we're psychologically vulnerable, and cortisol is then produced, hence why you get this sort of survival orientation. We only look out for ourselves, we don't care about everybody else. And again, going back to the right-hand side of the model, a purpose-driven model, we're led by values. We don't need to be managed by rules. We've got a group of people who are focused and passionate, and we have shared values, and it's actually the team that call out, poor behavior, not the leader's role. This is a growth mindset that underpins this. This is the recent, over the last 15 years, understanding that our brains are plastic. And that what we mean by that, neuroplasticity, is that we have more capacity than we understand, and that skills can continue to be developed all the way through our lives. And instead of command and control on the purpose-led side, agile and holacracy and are the theories that have really started to take traction. So that is basically the change that is happening, the big shift that's happening. And as leaders, unless we understand the science of how human beings thrive collectively and individually, then what we're doing is we're relying on all command and control styles of leadership that simply don't work. And for any of you who are working with younger people in the workforce now, any individual who's leading a diverse group of people will understand that the old sort of toolkit that we've all grown up with is no longer valid, or at least very, very significant parts of it are no longer valid. There are really important aspects of leadership, and particularly what we call agile leadership, that need to be understood now, and that includes things like positive psychology and neuroscience, systems theory, how teams thrive, high performance in teams, and so on and so forth. And a lot of that science comes from very different areas, but it can be simple. It doesn't have to be complicated, and that's really key. So I hope this video has been helpful. The world is changing enormously, and what I've tried to show in this sketch, really, this rough diagram, is why these changes are occurring, and to give you some sense of why your leadership skills will constantly need updating, because the science for a lot of this, particularly the neuroscience, is only 15 years old. So if you want to know a little more, I've put a link below this video in the description box that explains a little bit about Sherpa People Systems and what we do and our focus on agile leadership. But what I would say is just look at your environment now and ask yourself one very simple question. Am I in a survival-based organization, or am I in a purpose-based organization? It may be that you're trying to create a purpose-based team and you're sitting in a survival-based culture, and that's why it's such a challenge for you right now, because constantly you're coming up against a fear-based organizational culture that is trying to control and command your team in terms of what you're doing and your output and so on and so forth. I'd love to hear your comments. Once again, I want to thank the Leadership Circle that sort of started this thinking process for me at a deeper level, and allowing me a framework really upon which I could put a lot of the science that we teach in our courses onto one piece of paper. So I look forward to hearing from you. Wish you all the best.